"Don't take my dog." She screamed it the way children scream when they have understood something irreversible is happening and have decided that their volume might be the only instrument available. She was 9, brown-haired, holding onto a brown mixed-breed dog with one ear up and one ear folded, and the shelter intake worker was very gently, very professionally, trying to explain to the old man beside her what would happen next. The old man had his hat in his hands and was looking at the floor. Commander James Talbot had been standing at the counter 20 feet away, trying to convince his canine Kilo to walk through the intake gate, which Kilo was declining to do with the patient. Absolute refusal of a dog who has made a decision and is not going to revisit it. When the child screamed, Kilo turned toward the sound. He did not pull. He turned ears forward and looked at James, which was how Kilo communicated. "This is where we are supposed to be." James let him go. They crossed the shelter floor together. James put his hand on the intake counter and set down his card and said to the worker, "Hold the dog." He did not explain why. He signed the hold form they put in front of him. The worker stamped it. "Bugle, the dog." This was what it said on the intake card the old man had filled out. "Was on a 7-day administrative hold." The child stopped screaming. She didn't understand what had happened. Neither did the old man. James looked at both of them and said, "I need 10 minutes. That was the most he said in the next 2 hours. Subscribe if you haven't. This is the kind of story we tell here. James Talbot had been quiet since he got back, not temporarily, not in the way of a person processing and working their way through. Quiet as a condition, the way a house goes quiet after certain kinds of absence. He had done 11 deployments over 19 years of naval special warfare and had come home 8 months ago to an apartment in Lexington, Kentucky that was clean and organized and empty in the specific way of spaces that have not been inhabited by anyone who needed them. He cooked. He ran. He read. He was present in all the physical ways and absent in several others, and he had gotten very good at not naming this, which was a skill he had developed across 19 years of operating in environments where naming things was not always useful. A colleague from his team, a man who had retired 2 years before James did and who had, in James's assessment, figured some things out, had told him a dog would help. He had thought about this for 6 weeks. He had decided it was a reasonable suggestion. He had come to Lexington Animal Services this morning with Kilo in the passenger seat, with the specific intention of doing the responsible thing, which was to register Kilo in the shelter's veteran therapy placement program, where a 7-year-old retired Navy working dog with 3 deployments of experience could benefit more people than he was currently benefiting in James Talbot's apartment. This had seemed logical in James's apartment. It had seemed less logical in the parking lot of the shelter. It had seemed actively wrong in the intake area, which was where Kilo had stopped and refused to go further, and where James had been standing, unable to proceed, when the child screamed. Kilo was 7 years old, dark-coated, a Belgian Malinois with amber eyes, and 3 deployments that James had documented in official records, and 1 deployment that he had documented in no record at all because it had not officially happened, and he had been with James for all of it. He had been with James in the apartment for 8 months. He slept at the foot of the bed when James didn't sleep well, which was often, and he rode in the passenger seat on the drives James took at 2 in the morning when staying still was not available as an option. And he had, on exactly 1 occasion 6 months ago, climbed onto the couch beside James and put his head on James's chest and stayed there for an hour, which was not something Kilo typically did, and which James had not told anyone about, and which had helped in a way that James had also not discussed with anyone. He had come to this shelter today because Kilo deserved more than a man who was present in all the physical ways and absent in several others. Kilo had stopped walking toward the intake gate because Kilo was not willing to be surrendered to that logic. When the child screamed, Kilo knew what he was doing. James followed him. George Brennan had been 77 years old for 3 weeks, which meant he had been doing the arithmetic of 3 fewer years than he had expected to reach since his cardiologist's comment in August, and had been arriving at the same conclusion each time. There were things that needed doing while there was time to do them. He had served with the 7th Infantry Regiment in Korea in 1952 and 1953, had come home to Lexington with the specific flatness of a man who has seen things that don't translate and has decided to put them somewhere and get on with it, and had gotten on with it. He had worked the Lexington post office for 31 years. He had married Margaret O'Hara in 1969 and had moved into the apartment on Riverside Drive the year after, and had stayed. The apartment was on the third floor with windows facing east, and Margaret had put curtains on those windows in 1974 that were still there, a specific yellow that had faded to something between gold and cream. And George had never changed them because they were what the apartment looked like, and the apartment was what his life looked like. And he was not a man who changed things without a reason. Margaret had died 6 years ago, in the fall, in the apartment, in the chair by the east window where she liked to read in the afternoon light. His son Tommy had joined the Navy at 22, which George had been proud of in the specific way a man is proud when his child chooses something that asks something of them. Tommy had been 31 when the accident happened, on a training exercise off the Virginia coast. And the Navy had sent 2 people to George's door on a Wednesday morning, and George had sat down in the kitchen and had not gotten up for a very long time. Tommy's daughter, Emma, had been 4 years old. Her mother had made her own decisions after Tommy's death that did not include Emma, and so Emma had come to George, which was how things worked sometimes. And George had been 68 years old and raising a 4-year-old, and had found it the most useful thing that had happened to him in years. Bugle had wandered into the back alley behind Riverside Arms 3 years ago, thin and matted, and with a specific look of someone who has been managing alone for a while and has arrived at a door hoping it might open. George had given him water and the leftover from dinner and had not intended to keep him. Emma had named him the second day, which meant George was keeping him. He had been good for both of them in the way that certain presences are good. Uncomplicated, unconditional. In the morning and the evening and the middle of the night when Emma had bad dreams about things a 9-year-old shouldn't have in her memory but did. The no pets notice from Dwight Holt had arrived 6 weeks ago. 2 weeks after the notice, Holt had come to George's door in person and had told him to begin preparing to vacate the unit. He had mentioned, in the specific indirect language of a man who wants something understood without being said directly, that there was a lot of personal property in the apartment that would need to be addressed. He had looked at the corner of the living room where Margaret's things were. George had understood what Holt was looking at. He had told Emma this morning that they were going to the vet. He had managed this partial truth for 20 minutes on Route 68 before the truth of where they were going had become too heavy to carry, and he had told her. Emma had been quiet for the rest of the drive when they pulled into the Lexington Animal Services parking lot. She had asked once, "Please, Grandpa." George had held her hand and they had gone in. Is there someone in your life holding on to something that someone else is trying to take from them? A home? A dog? A piece of the life they built? If that person is still reachable, this might be the week to show up. Tell me about them below. James sat them down in the shelter's family meeting room, which had 3 chairs and a box of tissues, and the specific quality of a space designed for conversations that don't have easy shapes. Kilo positioned himself beside Emma and Bugle in the way that Kilo positioned himself beside things that needed positioning beside, solidly, with no indication of planning to move. Bugle, who had been handed back to Emma by the intake worker pending the hold processing, sat in Emma's lap and was still in a way that suggested he understood something about the value of stillness in uncertain situations. George told James about the apartment, the notice, the no pets clause Holt had cited. He told it in the orderly, specific way of a man who has worked a counter job for 31 years and knows how to state the relevant facts without editorializing. He had his hat in his hand still, turning it by the brim the way men turn things when they are in the middle of something they cannot stop. James listened. He did not say it would be fine. He did not offer an interpretation or a reassurance. He asked one question, "Do you have your original lease?" George did. He had kept everything, 47 years of paperwork, in binders in the bedroom closet, organized by year. He had brought the lease folder specifically because Holt had asked to review it, and he had learned something in 31 years of postal work about keeping things people might want to review. James asked for the lease number and year. Then he stepped out of the room and made 3 calls. He made them in the shelter's parking lot, standing in the November cold in Lexington, with the specific economy of a man who has spent 19 years making calls that needed to accomplish something before circumstances changed. The 3rd call was to a housing advocacy attorney at a veterans legal aid organization in Louisville. The attorney said she would call back in 40 minutes. She called back in 32. The no pets clause had been added to Riverside Arms' standard lease in 2011. George's lease had been signed in 1996. His original lease contained no such clause. The subsequent renewals he had signed, twice in 2009 and 2016, had incorporated new language in certain sections. But the pets clause had not been among the incorporated changes in either renewal. It was not in George's lease. The attorney said she could file a response to the eviction notice by end of week. James went back inside. He sat down and wrote two things on a piece of paper from the shelter's reception desk: the attorney's name and direct line, and his own number. He put the paper in front of George. He said, "She can file by Friday." George looked at the paper. He looked at James for a moment. He said Tommy was Navy. James was still. He did not say anything. He sat with that for the appropriate amount of time, which was long enough to mean something. George said, "He died on a training exercise 5 years ago." George said, "Emma's been with me since." They sat there. Bugle had not moved from Emma's lap. Kilo had not moved from beside Emma. The shelter's fluorescent lights made the specific sound that fluorescent lights make in rooms where people are saying things that need to be said. What Dwight Holt said when he arrived at the shelter 40 minutes later, and what George said in response to it, would be the end of the eviction notice. It would also be the end of Holt's pattern with the other long-term residents at Riverside Arms, once the housing advocacy attorney had seen what the attorney had seen. If you were Dwight Holt walking into that shelter and seeing a retired Navy SEAL waiting beside a 9-year-old girl and a military working dog, what would you have done differently? Type it below. I read every comment. Holt had been called by a neighbor of George's who worked shelter intake, not maliciously, but in the way of people who believe that informing the relevant parties is the responsible thing. He came in his property manager's jacket, prepared for a conversation with a compliant elderly man who had now appropriately surrendered the lease violation. He was not prepared for the room he walked into. James stood when Holt came through the shelter door. He did not move toward him. He stood the way James stood, with the specific stillness of a man who has been trained not to waste any movement, and looked at Holt with an expression that communicated, without words, that Holt was about to be in a conversation that required more preparation than he currently had. Kilo had been lying beside Emma. He rose. The sound from Kilo's chest was the low, continuous register of a dog that has assessed the situation and has made its position clear. Not alarm, not aggression exactly, but the steady, unbroken note that says, "I have finished deciding, and I have decided." He placed himself between Holt and Emma without being directed, and his eyes on Holt did not shift. Holt looked at the dog. He looked at James. He recalibrated toward George. He said, in the professional practice tone of a man who has had difficult property management conversations and has found this tone to be effective, "Mr. Brennan, I understand you've been dealing with a difficult situation. I want to be straightforward with you. The lease violation notice stands, and I think we both understand what needs to happen here." George looked at him. He said, "He told me to pack Margaret's things." He said it to the room, not as a weapon, not aimed, just stated plainly, the way he had been stating things plainly his whole life. The intake worker behind the counter looked at Holt. Emma was looking at Holt. She had stopped crying some time ago. She was watching Holt the way 9-year-olds watch adults who are doing something wrong, with the complete clarity of someone who has not yet learned to look away from it. James spoke. He said that George Brennan's original lease, signed in 1996, contained no pets restriction, and that the subsequent lease renewals had not incorporated the pets clause that appeared in the building's 2011 standard form. He said that a housing advocacy attorney had reviewed the lease documentation and would be filing a formal response to the eviction notice by Friday. He said that the attorney had also identified 3 other Riverside Arms residents, all of them long-term elderly tenants in the building's ground floor units, all of them served with lease violation notices in the past 18 months, who had asked to have their leases reviewed as part of the same filing. He said it with the precision of someone reporting a situation: facts, sequence, implications. Holt said something about property management protocols and resident management procedures. James said, "The attorney's name is on the paper Mr. Brennan has." Holt looked at Kilo, who had not moved. Kilo's eyes had not left Holt. He looked at George, who was sitting with his hat in his hands, looking at Holt with the patient, unhurried expression of a man who has been dealing with difficult situations for 77 years and has learned that patience is not the same as weakness. He looked at Emma, who was holding Bugle in her lap, with the specific completeness of a child holding something that is hers. He left without addressing any of these things directly. The property manager's jacket crossed the parking lot. The car left. Kilo sat down. He sat between Emma and the door, and he stayed there, and the specific sound that had been in his chest was gone. Bugle's tail moved for the first time since George had walked him through the shelter's front door. The eviction notice was withdrawn within 10 days of the attorney's filing. The lease review found that George Brennan's 1996 lease contained no valid pets restriction, which the property management company was unwilling to test in court. The three other residents, identified by the attorney's review, received the same finding. One of them had already vacated. The company offered a settlement that the attorney described as better than it would have been before the filing. Bugle went home to the apartment on Riverside Drive and slept at the foot of Emma's bed, which was where he had slept every night for 3 years, and where he continued to sleep. Margaret's curtains were still on the east windows. George still set the table the way Margaret had always set it, which Emma had asked about once, and which George had explained in the specific, matter-of-fact way that George explained things, and Emma had accepted this in the way that children accept the particular shapes of the people who love them. James went back to the shelter on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later. He went to the front counter and asked for the formal adoption paperwork for a male Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, chip number on file. The worker found the file and printed the forms. James signed them. He brought Kilo home. He had already brought Kilo home 8 months ago. The paperwork was the acknowledgement that he had been home all along. He had done 11 deployments and come back to a quiet apartment and had been operating on the premise that quiet was what he needed. What he had needed was different from quiet. He had needed the thing that Kilo had been providing for 8 months, which was not complicated but was necessary, and which he was no longer going to call responsible behavior and no longer going to try to give away. He started volunteering at the shelter 3 weeks later. He came on Tuesday mornings. He did not say much. He did the things that needed doing, with the specific, unhurried competence of a man who has learned to do what is in front of him. The shelter staff did not know his history. They knew he was reliable and that his dog was good with the other animals, and that he brought coffee for the desk workers without being asked. On a Tuesday morning in March, Emma came to the shelter with George for a school visit. George's granddaughter, who had screamed in this building's lobby 6 months ago and been heard, walked through the front door and looked around the intake area until she found James. She said, "You're here." James said, "Yes." She looked at Kilo. She looked at James. She said, "Will you come to Grandpa's birthday? He makes yellow cake." He said, "What day?" He didn't explain. He just showed up. That was the whole of his character and the whole of the story and all that had ever been needed from him. He had not meant to keep the dog. He had not meant to get involved in the eviction. He had not meant to become the person who brought coffee on Tuesday mornings and showed up to birthday dinners in apartments, with east-facing windows and Margaret's curtains still on the glass. He had come to a shelter to do the responsible thing, and his dog had refused to move through a gate, and a child had screamed, and he had followed his dog, which was what you did when you had been doing this for 7 years, and the dog was right more often than you were. He didn't explain. He signed the papers. The rest followed. This story is for every child who held on, for every old man who brought his hat in his hands to a counter he didn't want to be at because he thought it was the only option left, and for every person in a quiet apartment who has been operating on the wrong premise about what they need. Is there someone in your life who is about to give something up that they shouldn't have to give up? A home, a dog, a part of themselves? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe, so you're here for the next one. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.